The transport truck lurched to a stop on a dirt road outside Wichita, Kansas, throwing Carl Messner against the wooden slat bench. Through the gap in the canvas cover, he caught his first glimpse of American farmland in daylight. What he saw made no sense. The field stretched to the horizon, easily 400 acres, maybe more, planted in perfect rows of wheat that rippled like a golden ocean in the June wind. A red barn stood 3 stories tall, its paint fresh and unblistered. Beside it sat a house with glass in every window, a covered porch, and what looked like electric lines running to the roof. In the yard, a woman hung white sheets on a clothesline, while 2 children chased a dog between fruit trees heavy with apples. Carl had been a prisoner of war for 7 weeks. He was 23 years old. Before we continue with Carl's story and the moment that would break him completely, we need your help to keep these forgotten perspectives alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history beyond the battlefield. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of the human side of World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Texas to Tokyo, from small farms to major cities. Did your grandfather serve? Did your family farm during the war years? Do you have a connection to this period? We want to hear from you. Now, back to that dirt road outside Wichita, where Carl Messner was about to have everything he believed shattered in a single afternoon. Carl Messner grew up in Schwäbisch Gmünd, a town of 28, Zozera in southern Germany, where his father worked as a machinist at a tool factory. Their apartment had 4 rooms for 6 people. Carl slept in the same bed as his 2 younger brothers until he was 17. The apartment had electricity 3 hours per evening. They shared a toilet with 2 other families on their floor. This was normal. This was Germany. His father earned enough for black bread. Potatoes? Occasional pork on Sundays. Their greatest luxury was his mother's sewing machine, purchased after 4 years of saving. When Carl was 12, his father took him to see the countryside, rolling hills, dense forests, villages of timber and stone, where families had lived for centuries. This, his father said, is what we protect. This is Germany. Carl believed it with his whole heart. In 1941, at age 19, he volunteered for the Wehrmacht. Not because of ideology. His family never joined the party, but because his father's factory had been bombed twice, because ration cards bought less each month, because the recruitment officer promised 3 meals a day and a uniform that fit. Also because everyone said America would never actually fight. The Americans were soft, spoiled, concerned only with money and movies. They would supply England, yes, but send their own boys to die in European mud. Never. Carl believed that too. Everyone did. He fought in North Africa with the 15th Panzer Division. He watched men die from artillery, from infection, from heat that turned the inside of a tank into an oven. He saw the British collapse under Rommel's advance at Gazala. He believed Germany would win because Germany had always won, because the Americans still hadn't arrived, because what other ending could there be? Then came El Alamein, October 23, 1942. The British brought 1 Zo-29 tanks. They brought artillery that fired for 4 straight hours before the infantry even moved. They brought supplies that seemed infinite: fresh ammunition, medical kits, fuel, food. Carl's unit had 67 operational tanks at the start of the battle. They had 31 by the end of the first week. They retreated 700 miles across the desert, fighting, starving, abandoning equipment. On April 12, 1943, Carl's tank took a direct hit from an American Sherman near Beja, Tunisia. His driver died instantly. Carl and his gunner, Georg Hirsch, surrendered to American infantry 20 minutes later, with their hands above their heads and their uniforms smoking from burning oil. Georg had talked constantly about after the war. He wanted to work in his uncle's printing shop in Munich, marry his girlfriend Elsa, have children before he was 30. He and Carl planned to visit each other every Christmas, swap stories, grow old as friends who had survived together. Georg died of pneumonia in a transit camp in Oran 3 weeks after capture. His last words were asking Carl to write to Elsa. Carl never got her address. He never knew if she survived the bombing of Munich. He wrote the letter anyway and carried it in his pocket, folded, the ink fading. That was how Karl Messner ended up on a transport ship to America, processed through Camp Shanks in New York, loaded onto a train that crossed a continent, and finally placed on a truck driving through Kansas toward a work detail that needed farm labor. He expected a prison camp, barbed wire, guard towers, poor food, hard work. He didn't expect what he was about to see. The truck stopped at a farm owned by a man named Harold Dietrich, 48 years old, a third-generation wheat farmer whose own son was currently fighting in the Pacific with the 41st Infantry Division. Harold needed help bringing in his harvest. The Army's POW labor program assigned him 8 German prisoners under light guard for 6 weeks of work. Karl climbed down from the truck with 7 other men, all former Afrika Korps, all skeletal from transit rations and months of combat. The guard, a corporal from Nebraska named Stevens, told them in broken German to line up for inspection. Harold Dietrich walked the line, looking each man in the face, nodding. Then he said, "You boys hungry?" Stevens translated. The prisoners stared. Harold gestured toward his house. "Come on, my wife made lunch." They followed him across the yard, past the barn, onto that covered porch Karl had seen from the road. Inside, the kitchen had running water from a pump at the sink, a wood stove, a radio, linoleum floors, pictures on the walls, family photographs, a painting of horses, a cross-stitched blessing. Harold's wife, Margaret, had set a table for 10. On that table, a pot roast with carrots and potatoes, fresh bread with butter, green beans, a pitcher of milk, apple pie cooling on the windowsill. Karl stopped breathing. One of the other prisoners, a man named Werner from Hamburg, made a sound like a wounded animal. He covered his mouth with both hands, his shoulders shook. "Sit down," Harold said through Stevens. "Eat." They sat. They stared at the food. Werner was crying openly now, tears running down his face into his beard. He kept saying, "Es tut mir leid, es tut mir leid. I'm sorry, in a whisper to no one. Karl picked up his fork. His hand trembled so badly he nearly dropped it. He cut a piece of pot roast, put it in his mouth, chewed. The texture was wrong. Too tender, too rich. His stomach had forgotten what real meat tasted like. He swallowed. He took another bite. He realized he was crying too. They all were. 8 German prisoners of war, weeping over lunch in a Kansas farmhouse, unable to stop, unable to speak, while Harold and Margaret Dietrich watched in quiet, uncomprehending kindness. Corporal Stevens stood in the corner, arms crossed, saying nothing. Later, he would report that the prisoners showed appropriate gratitude and caused no disciplinary issues. He didn't mention the crying. It wasn't relevant to his report. After lunch, Harold walked them out to the wheat fields. He showed them the equipment, a combine harvester, bright red, pulled by a tractor with an enclosed cab and rubber tires. "John Deere Model B," Harold said, patting the hood like a beloved horse. "Bought her in '41. Makes the work almost easy." Karl knew farm equipment. Before the war, he'd visited his cousin's farm outside Ulm during harvest season. His cousin owned a scythe and a hand-cranked thresher shared with 3 neighboring families. The work took 6 weeks of dawn to dusk labor. Every able-bodied person helped. Children, elderly, women. They harvested 40 acres and called it a good year. Harold Dietrich farmed 640 acres, alone. With his wife and 1 hired hand who was currently fixing a fence 3 miles away. The combine cut, threshed, and collected wheat in a single pass. It could harvest 10 acres per day. The grain poured into a truck bed in a golden stream, clean and ready for market. Harold drove the combine himself, steering with 1 hand, adjusting the header with a lever, while the machine did work that would have required 50 men in Germany. Karl watched this for 30 minutes without speaking. Then he walked away from the group, past the barn, into a grove of cottonwood trees where no one could see him. He sat on the ground and put his head in his hands. Everything they had told him was a lie. Germany had been at war since 1939. 4 years of total mobilization. Every factory converted to war production. Every luxury eliminated. Every resource rationed, conserved, redirected. Women working in armament plants. Children collecting scrap metal. Cities bombed. Farms stripped of men and horses. The entire nation straining, sacrificing. enduring because they were told this was necessary to survive, to win, to protect the fatherland from enemies who wanted to destroy them. And America, the soft, decadent Americans, had only entered the war in December 1941, less than 2 years ago. Yet they had sent millions of men overseas, built thousands of ships and tanks and planes, supplied the British and Russians, invaded North Africa and Sicily and Italy, and still their farms looked like this. Their farmers ate pot roast and pie. Their barns had fresh paint. Their children played in yards with dogs and fruit trees. They weren't even trying. This was normal for them. This was just life. Karl had believed Germany was strong because Germany was disciplined, organized, willing to sacrifice. He had believed the Allies would collapse because they were weak, divided, too comfortable to endure hardship. But America wasn't comfortable despite the war. America was comfortable during the war, which meant their capacity, their sheer industrial, agricultural, logistical capacity, was so vast that feeding Europe's armies was barely an inconvenience. Germany had been fighting with everything it had. America had been fighting with one hand, and Germany was losing. Karl sat in that grove of cottonwood trees and understood with perfect clarity that the war was over, had always been over. Germany had doomed itself the moment it made an enemy of a nation that could feed its prisoners pot roast, while its own soldiers ate steak in foxholes. When he came back, Werner grabbed his arm. "Did you see the barn?" Werner's voice was shaking. "The barn, Karl. It has concrete floors, concrete, and electric lights, and machines for milking. One man's barn is better than my father's entire factory." Another prisoner, a man named Friedrich from Bavaria, said, "My village shared 2 tractors, 2, for 20 farms. And they were French models from 1925. "The children," someone else said. "Did you see how fat the children are?" They worked that afternoon in silence, loading wheat sheaves, cleaning equipment, doing whatever Harold asked. The work was easy, easier than anything they'd done in the military. No one shot at them, no one screamed. At 6 p.m., Harold said they were done for the day. He brought out cold water in glass bottles and let them rest in the shade. That night, back at the POW camp, a collection of barracks surrounded by a single fence, barely guarded, Karl lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling. Around him, men whispered in the dark. "Is it all like this? All of America?" "It can't be. That farm must be special. Rich." Harold said his farm is average. Average. I don't believe him. Why would he lie? No one had an answer. Over the following weeks, the prisoners worked 6 farms in rotation. Every single one was the same. Large, mechanized, prosperous, electric lights, running water, tractors, trucks, barns that could have housed 30 families. Farmers who owned 400, 500, 800 acres and worked them with a handful of people. One farmer had a teenage son who drove a car, his own car, a blue Ford Coupe, to school every morning. Karl watched this boy, 17 years old, complain about gasoline rationing while driving past in a personal automobile. In Germany, only party officials and military officers had personal cars. Everyone else walked or took trains when there was fuel for trains. Another farmer owned 3 tractors. 3. "In case one breaks down," he explained. A farmer's wife showed them her kitchen, an electric refrigerator, an electric stove, a washing machine, a radio the size of a suitcase. She apologized for the washing machine being old. "It's from 1938, she said. "I want one of the new models when the war's over." Karl wanted to scream. He wanted to grab her shoulders and explain that his mother washed clothes by hand in a tub, that she had done this her entire life, that she had never even imagined a machine that could wash clothes, that the idea of apologizing for a washing machine from 1938 was so absurd it made his chest hurt. Instead, he nodded politely and said, "It's very nice." At night, the prisoners argued. Some insisted this was propaganda, that the Americans were showing them only the richest farms to break their morale. Others said no, this was real, all of it, because you couldn't fake this many farms, this much equipment, this level of casual abundance. A man named Otto, a fervent party member before the war, insisted America was secretly starving, that these farms were exceptions, that the newsreels had told the truth about breadlines and poverty. Werner said, Otto, I've seen the guards' garbage. They throw away more food in a day than my family ate in a week. Otto went quiet. He never spoke about it again. The breaking point came in mid-July. Harold Dietrich invited the prisoners to a community gathering, a 4th of July celebration, delayed by 2 weeks because of the harvest schedule. The local VFW hall hosted a dinner for farmers and their families. Harold asked the camp commander for permission to bring his work detail. The commander surprisingly agreed. Good for morale, he said. Shows them what they're missing. 30 families gathered in a hall decorated with American flags and bunting. Long tables covered with food. Fried chicken, ham, corn on the cob, potato salad, coleslaw, rolls, butter, 3 kinds of pie, lemonade, coffee. Children ran between tables. Men talked about crop yields and weather. Women discussed ration stamp strategies and news from sons overseas. The prisoners sat at a table in the corner, served the same food as everyone else, mostly ignored. They ate in silence. Then someone brought out a phonograph. Music played, big band swing, Tommy Dorsey. A few couples started dancing. The children squealed and spun each other around. An old man played fiddle, people clapped. Carl watched a girl, maybe 16, laughing as she danced with her father. She wore a yellow dress and saddle shoes. Her hair was curled. She looked happy. Not grateful to be alive, happy. Not relieved the bombing stopped, happy. Just happy. Normal, thoughtless. Every day, happy. Werner leaned over and whispered, "They don't even know there's a war." He didn't mean it literally, obviously they knew. Half the men in the room probably had sons overseas. But they didn't feel it. Not the way Carl felt it. Not the way Europe felt it. The war was something happening elsewhere to other people, while life here continued with only minor inconveniences. Carl thought about his sisters in Schwäbisch Gmünd. He'd received 1 letter since capture, smuggled through the Red Cross 8 months old. His youngest sister wrote that she was working in a munitions factory, 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. She was 15. The factory had been bombed twice. She wrote, "But we keep working. For Germany. For our future." Carl looked at the girl in the yellow dress, spinning and laughing, and he thought, "We already lost. We lost before we started. Because we were fighting people who can have this while they fight us." He excused himself and walked outside. He found a spot behind the VFW hall near a dumpster, and he finally let himself fall apart. He slid down the wall, sat in the dirt, and cried like he hadn't cried since Georg died. He cried for his friend, for his sisters, for his father at the factory, for every German soldier still fighting a war that had already ended, for himself, for the stupid, ignorant, arrogant belief that Germany could win against this. Corporal Stevens found him there 20 minutes later. Stevens sat down next to him, didn't say anything, just pulled out a pack of Chesterfields and offered one. Carl took it. They smoked together in silence. Finally, Stevens said, "You okay?" Carl nodded. He wasn't, but there was no point explaining. Stevens said, "You know, my grandpa came from Germany, 1887, settled in Nebraska. He used to tell me stories about the old country, how hard it was, how much better things were here." Stevens took a drag. "I think he'd be real sad about all this, about us fighting each other." Carl said nothing. What could he say? They sat there until the music stopped, and it was time to go back to camp. The prisoners worked Kansas farms until September 1945. After Germany surrendered in May, the work continued because the wheat still needed harvesting and America still needed feeding. Itself, its armies, its allies, the starving populations of liberated Europe. Carl learned that American farms produced so much excess grain that the government paid farmers not to plant certain fields to avoid collapsing prices. He learned this while standing in a field that was deliberately left fallow, empty, wasted, because there was too much food. He laughed when Harold told him. It was not a happy laugh. In September, Carl was transferred to a camp in Iowa to process paperwork for repatriation. He spent 4 months in limbo, waiting for a ship back to Europe, back to a Germany that no longer existed as he'd known it. Other prisoners talked about what they'd find when they returned. No one had good predictions. In January 1946, Carl boarded a Liberty ship in New York Harbor. The voyage took 12 days. He landed in Bremen, and took a train south to what was now the American occupation zone. Schwäbisch Gmünd had been bombed 7 times. His family's apartment building was rubble. His father had died in 1944 from infection after a factory accident. His mother and sisters were living with an uncle in a village 30 kilometers away. Karl found them. They cried. They fed him watery potato soup. It was all they had. His youngest sister, the one who'd worked in the munitions factory, looked 20 years older than when he'd last seen her. She was 17. She asked him what America was like. Karl said, "It's fine." He never told them the truth. What would be the point? Karl Messner worked as a mechanic in Stuttgart for 34 years. He married in 1949, had 3 children, lived in a modest apartment that eventually got electricity all day and an indoor bathroom. He was quiet, reliable, unremarkable. He never joined veterans organizations. He never talked about the war. In 1973, his youngest son, studying history at university, asked him what it was like to be a prisoner in America. Karl thought for a long time. Then he said, "They had everything. We had nothing. That's all there was to it." His son waited for more. Karl said nothing else. In 1982, a researcher from the University of Heidelberg interviewed former POWs about their experiences in American camps. She found Karl through military records. She asked him about treatment, conditions, labor. Karl answered politely but briefly. Then she asked, "What surprised you most about America?" Karl was silent for almost a minute. The tape recorder kept running. Finally he said, "The farms, I couldn't believe the farms. One man doing the work of 50, machines everywhere, food like I'd never seen, and it was normal for them, just normal." His voice cracked. "We thought we were the great power. We thought we were strong. Then I saw a Kansas wheat field, and I knew we'd already lost. We were fighting giants, and we didn't even know it." The researcher asked him to elaborate. Karl shook his head. "That's all. That's everything." The interview ended. The researcher published a paper that mentioned Karl's observation in 1 paragraph. No one paid much attention. Karl Messner died in 1991 at the age of 71 from heart failure. His obituary in the local paper was 3 sentences long. It mentioned his work as a mechanic and his family. It did not mention the war. His son found a box of his father's belongings after the funeral. Inside, a medal from the Afrika Korps, some letters, a photograph of Georg Hirsch and a folded piece of paper, the letter to Elsa that was never sent. The ink faded to brown. The words still legible. At the bottom of the box, a single postcard, showing a wheat field in Kansas, purchased from a tourist shop in Wichita in 1945. Karl had carried it for 46 years. On the back, in pencil, 1 sentence in German. "Dies ist der Feind, den wir nie besiegen konnten. This is the enemy we could never defeat. If this story moved you, hit that like button." These forgotten perspectives, the moments that changed everything for individual men, need people like you to keep them alive. Subscribe so you never miss another story from the human side of World War II, and tell us in the comments, what surprised you most about this story? Do you have family connections to World War II, either side? We want to hear from you. Thank you for keeping these memories alive.